All right. Well, I want to welcome Larry to the show. He's from the Dad Edge Alliance and podcast. He's got a lot of awesome information. I'm so excited to have a dad on my show.
I'm excited to be here. I love your show. I love your podcast. Thank you, Google, for allowing me to find you.
Yes. Thank you, Google, too, because I have fell in love with your podcast, too. And it's a really good one. Just listening to it. And I was trying to get my husband to listen to it, too. So we'll get into all that. It's really good to get the male perspective. And it's even better to get the father perspective, I think, because a lot of times I think as parents, as moms, we struggle. So before we get into it, could you give us a little bit about your journey and how you came to do what you do?
Sure. I can usually wrap this up within about 2 minutes or so. Basically, my story is sort of odd, interesting, sort of, but my parents were married in 1971. I was born in 1975. By the time I was 9 months old, my parents got divorced and my dad was gone. Never saw him. My mom got remarried when I was 4. They got divorced when I was 10. He was a great guy. He adopted me, took me in as his own. Unfortunately, he had a drinking problem, and he was verbally and mentally abusive when he was drinking. Super nice guy when he wasn't. So that was 10. And by the time I was 12, something interesting happened. I started asking more questions about my biological father and all that stuff, and I had an opportunity to meet him at 12, which was really cool and also very nerve-wracking, right? So our relationship lasted only a few months, unfortunately, and then he was out again. And he had gotten remarried, had a 2-year-old son, another one on the way, and I think at that point in time for him, life was just very complicated. And so fast forward to I was 30, which was 2 years ago. I'm kidding. It was 13 years ago.
I was like, okay.
Yeah, right. Oh, thank you. So 13 years ago, I was in a Starbucks and my dad came walking in and
Wow.
I recognized him right away. It had been 20 years, but not much had changed. And we ended up, I won't go into the detail of how we connected, but we ended up talking, getting together. And now here we are 13 years later, and we have a relationship. I have 2 younger half brothers that I'm really close to. He's been married to the same woman for 40 years. We don't necessarily have this father-son relationship. We more have a friendship, which is fine. I think that's what serves the relationship very, very well. But going back to my childhood, really just had half my childhood was spent without a father figure, and the other half was my mom was married 3 times. Each guy was usually some sort of addict, usually some sort of alcohol was involved or drugs or whatever else. And then usually that relationship was really, really toxic, right? So half the childhood was without a dad, half the childhood was usually with some sort of toxic male figure. And I'm not sharing this out of pity. If anything, I'm grateful. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's taken a lot of work to get to this place, but I'm grateful for what that journey gave me because it gave me a great example of what not to do, right? But I had this awakening in 2012 because as much as I wanted to be this great father, I was kind of stuck like in this limbo. And at the time I had 2 boys, 6 and 4. And I knew exactly what not to do, but I didn't know what to do. So I was like really stuck in this middle road and I was not showing up the way I wanted to. Like I was the typical guy. I was the typical guy that we serve now, which is didn't have a lot of patience. Had a hot temper. I was frustrated. I got all my validation through work. I was really great at my job. So that's where I spent my time. That's where I got my pat on the back, my attaboys, blowing out quota or doing whatever else. I wasn't the best when it came to marriage either. I wasn't the best communicator. I kept everything inside. I wasn't vulnerable with my wife. I didn't connect with her. And, it just really had this awakening when my youngest was 4 at the time. I spanked him and I spanked him so hard he hit the ground. And I knew at that point, I was like, I've got to do something different. And it was at that moment that I was in my office, I was sitting at my computer and I was on social media and the words, Good Dad Project just came out. And I created a page for it. And Good Dad Project was actually me. I was like, I'm done living this way. I need to be better. And I'm willing to just be a student at this point. And so I just opened myself up to it. And then in 2015, I wrote the book, The Dad's Edge. And basically how I wrote that book, it did not come from an expert point of view. It was like more or less like, hey, I've learned a few things. And it was more like having a conversation with my best friend. Same year we started the podcast. Podcast's been around for 4 years. And here we are today. We serve thousands of men now. Podcast has been a huge success. And I still I'm still a student of this. There isn't a day that goes by I don't make a million mistakes. But that's the cool thing about it is the podcast and the platform has really given us a community to be a student and to learn. And that's what we do, is to continually learn.
I love that. And I think, I feel like we're all students. I think anyone who thinks they know everything about whatever they talk about doesn't know anything, because we're all learning. We're in parenting and marriage, in relationships, in being human. We're all learning. So, I like that humble approach. I want to ask you, and I know you have 4 kids, and we were just talking before the show that one of them has anxiety. Is it your now 12-year-old?
11.
12. I mean 11. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's good. I can't keep them straight either.
Let me tell you how old your child is.
Yeah.
But I wonder, and we'll just jump right into it. Like, how do you get your partner to have an epiphany like that? I was hearing you describe yourself pre, all of this aha moment that you had that came from a very dark place, where you just were not happy with how you parented. But I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are like, how can I get my husband to take a step back? And maybe we don't control that as women. I don't know.
I don't think women do. And I don't think women should necessarily carry that burden. It's kind of like, and not to compare a wonderful husband to like my mom who drank a lot, as much as I wanted her to stop drinking, I was powerless over that. As much as I would try to show her like, man, it's just, our relationship's so good, when you're not drinking, and all these great things happen when you're not, it doesn't really matter. It sort of falls on deaf ears, right? Yeah. We always say that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, right? Not to say that men need teachers, but I will say this, one quote that we use all the time in our mastermind community, which is isolation is the enemy of excellence. And most men are living that life, that lone wolf, right? That lone wolf syndrome that we all carry. And the one thing I'll share about the lone wolf is that some men look at that and take a lot of pride, like, I'm the lone wolf, I'm strong, right? That's not the case. The secret is 2 things happen to the lone wolf. The lone wolf has lost the pack because he's going to go off and die on his own, or he's lost the pack and he's going to go die on his own. So either way, it's not a good ending for the lone wolf, and that's why the lone wolf is not a good thing. It's something that hurts us. And most men are living that way. We're living isolated. And if you look out in society, everybody's pointing at you saying, man up, be a man, be tough, be mentally tough, be strong. And men are like, well, I can't possibly admit that there might be a problem here, or I can't possibly admit that I'm struggling here, because that's not what society wants me to do. And certainly not what my wife wants me to do. So I think it gets to that point where you have to understand what men are going through mentally. And all day long, men are being pulled in a gazillion different directions with their job. Someone needs something from them at all times. And I think it's safe to say, for the most part, men are not necessarily doing the work, what we call in our community, doing the work that makes you come alive. They're at work, they're getting a paycheck, and a lot of men just feel unbelievably trapped. I can't do anything else. I can't make a career change. I can't do what I love because I have these 3 or 4 or 5 people that depend on me. So that's what's usually going through the minds of men on a professional level. And then on a personal level, I say this all the time, and it sounds so simple to us, but when you really think about it, think of a guy who is in IT, right? You have to have usually a 4-year degree, or you have to have some serious training to go do that job. If you're a surgeon, you have 8 years of education, and then a residency, and then sometimes even a fellowship to be able to cut somebody open and do something. When you're a father and a husband, number one, you better know how to do it, or at least that's what we think, right? It better come natural to you. And if it doesn't come naturally to you, then chances are you're not a good husband, you're not a good father. But literally, it's like, okay, you're married, go figure it out. Oh, hey, now your finances are combined, go figure it out. Oh, hey, you just took this kid home from the hospital, go figure it out. Best of luck, right? And that's very frustrating when you think of your job. Like if you're an IT guy, or if you're a surgeon, let's say you're a surgeon, never had any training, You go in the OR, you scrub in, you put your gown and gloves on, your mask, and they're like, okay, go ahead and do this total knee. Let's see how it works out for you. And that's literally what it feels like to us. And it's very humbling, but we can't admit like, hey, I'm struggling with this. So I think when it comes to women, back to your question of communicating with their husbands, you have to know where those men are probably at emotionally and mentally, because that's where we're at. And it's very frustrating for us, but we don't want to tell you that we're frustrated because that's not manly, right?
Yeah. And it's a good perspective shift, because I think that we as women don't look at it that way. We look at it because I think a lot of times we're more emotionally maybe in tune, if you want to stereotype. And
Totally.
so we don't look at it from the male perspective. We don't look at it from our husband's perspective. We just look at it like they're being stubborn, or they're not being empathetic enough. And we're not looking at it from that maybe they feel like a failure, or maybe they feel like they don't know where to start, or maybe they're feeling overwhelmed because they come home and they're exhausted already. Just taking a step back and putting ourselves in their shoes first before we kind of approach them head on. And it's not going to be received well. It never is, with a lack mentality.
I totally agree. And I think the other thing too, and you probably know about this more than anybody, understanding someone's love language, I think, is so important. And I'm sure you already know this, but in my experience with men anyway, words of affirmation go so far with a man, and it's very, very far and few between that we hear, man, I really appreciate you. You are just doing such an amazing job. And I know sometimes you don't feel like it, but you are. And what you do for us and this family and your company and everything you do, it is so appreciated, and it doesn't go unseen. That is like gold to a man for the most part. When we hear that, it literally, I think what it does is it just helps us open up a little bit, like, wow, maybe this is a space where I can now be vulnerable back, because that connection has been there, right? And I think what a lot of men do, and women don't really understand it either, and they're not meant to, is that we try to connect with you guys physically, right? That's like our thing. And women are like, well, hey, wait a second. You haven't connected with me emotionally. How do you expect to connect with me physically, right? So you have the man who's like, okay, like, I want to connect. Let's be physical. And then you have women like, well, wait a second. I want to connect with you emotionally first. But I think sometimes that for women and men to connect, sometimes it's great for the woman to go first, and to maybe share a perspective like that of appreciation, because it does, I think, help the man give back, in an emotional way.
Yeah. And I think having no expectations of, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to do something back because I did this. And I think just giving to give, being to be, and just being present with your partner without any expectation of, okay, I'm going to do this so that you can maybe treat the kids better, or maybe that you can be a better father or a better husband. It's just, I think, just starting from just total gratitude of what is actually going well. I think it's hard for the parents probably listening, some of the parents listening to my podcast, because they're dealing with a lot of anxiety and OCD and things. Their child is not doing okay. And so their focus is more on that child. And then maybe they're educating themselves, they're learning approaches. And I get emails almost on a weekly basis about how, and in my Facebook group on a daily basis, how do I get my husband on board? I'm doing this, and this, and he is just, not getting it, or he's yelling and he's getting frustrated. And I think it's coming from maybe a fear of, like, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah. I think that is so true. Like, there's nothing more frustrating. And I think especially for men, we tend to lash out because it's like, I just don't know how to fix this. And for men, as we all know, fixing is everything, right? We want to fix, even to our demise. We want to fix everything, but sometimes we have to, and nothing's more humbling than not knowing the answer. So we get frustrated. And then the other thing I think that men do that maybe women should probably realize as well is that men do a lot of shooting on ourselves. We're really good at shitting on ourselves, like all the time. So we, not only, so when a man loses his temper and he doesn't know the answer of how to help his kid out of anxiety or depression, or maybe a behavioral issue, like they're mad, they're upset at the situation, but then they're mad at themselves because I should know how to fix this. And because I don't, I'm obviously not the father I need to be if I don't know the answer. So it's like, it's this double frustration. I'm frustrated what's happening externally because like I don't know what's up with this behavior. And now I'm frustrated internally because I should know the answer. And nothing can make us more unhappier than shooting on ourselves all the time.
I like that. Shitting on yourselves. I'm going to
Shitting on
steal
ourselves.
that. That's a good one for anybody. So what would you suggest if, how could a wife help their husband or their partner? They don't have to be married. And it doesn't even have to go, it could be either way, but we're talking about men and women today. How do you get your husband to recognize your child's anxiety without them getting defensive? Because I know with some husbands, I won't mention mine, if you say you should do this, it's probably 10 times worse in my house because I'm a therapist. And so it's coming from a clinical professional point of view too. So it could be even more demeaning where it's like, don't say that to the kids or don't say that to him. His anxiety is going to go, that doesn't go down well. So how can parents approach their partners in a better way?
In my unprofessional and minimal experience, right? So there's been a couple of podcast guests that I've had on that are luckily way smarter than me. And I've been able to learn a couple things from them that I can share with you on communication that I've seen help. So number one, I think going back to like, let's maybe lay the foundation of communication between a man and a woman, right? I think what you said earlier is so powerful about not having an expectation to do something or an agenda. I think, from a man's perspective, I'll rub my wife's shoulders if I know I'm going to get something out of it, right? Yeah. Or maybe I'll pay her some compliments. Hopefully, like she'll see me like as more attractive or something like that. And then, of course, women, they'll do the same as well. But I think if you can, and one other quote that we say all the time is, look at your family and look at your wife through the eyes of appreciation and not expectation. And that's a really powerful thing to do because it gets you off of that agenda and it puts you into that state of gratitude where you're like, I don't have an agenda. I don't have an expectation. I look at you and what you're doing through the eyes of appreciation. So if women can approach their men with, hey, I'm going to come at you through the perspective of appreciation, not expectation, I think that sets the stage for better communication. The other thing too is I had a guest on who wrote the book called Never Split the Difference. His name is Chris Voss. He was the chief negotiator for the FBI, chief hostage negotiator for the FBI. And he wrote this book on communication. And the book, like I said, is called Never Split the Difference. And when he came on the show, the book is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And you would think like, oh, it's a negotiation book for like salespeople or somebody who's doing something with negotiation. And I joked with Chris and I was like, your book is like a master's in communication. Like just some of the things, the way our psyche works as far as when someone's communicating with us, how we approach them. And so like, for instance, I think when women come to a man with the approach of, hey, you need to do this, or you should do that, or why, I'll get to why here in a second. Why are you acting like this? I think if you come to the person, and this is with anyone in your life, it could be your kid, it could be your coworker, it could be your spouse, it could be friends, it could be family. I think when you come to a conversation, you can say, I just want to let you know that I've noticed a few things lately that I know our child struggles with anxiety. And I just want to point out the other day that when our son was throwing a fit, you seem so calm and cool and collected. Now, side note real quick, he probably isn't like that all the time, but maybe he had a moment, right? Yeah. Where he was able to handle it well. If the wife was saying, tell me what was going through your mind when you are calm, cool, and collected, because I struggle with this too. I really, really do. I struggle with this too. And I want to know what was going through your mind so maybe I can replicate that when we have those moments as well. What you've just done is I use the term nagging very, very lightly, but that's the way sometimes we view it when we hear the, I need you, I expect you, you should. But when you do that, the guy suddenly feels appreciated and like, wow, yeah, hold on, let me reflect upon that. let me put myself back in that situation, because what you're doing is you're putting that person back in that situation, hoping they relive that moment and then they repeat it themselves, right? But you're also communicating, and they're sharing insight with you. But what you've just done is you've complimented your man, and you've put him back in the situation and say, that's a really good idea. So let's just say the guy was like, I just took myself out of the situation for a minute and I put myself in his shoes. And as much as I wanted to react, I somehow created emotional space to just be calm. And I knew that if I reacted hardcore, that it would just be like fuel on the fire. And that's awesome. What if we were able to just sit down and maybe write a family mission statement, or a mission statement between me and you, that when our son or daughter or whatever else is acting in this way, this is the way we operate. Like, wow, like what an amazing way to come together as a family. Now you feel like a team instead of you need to do this. And the same thing goes for a guy. If a guy can communicate that with his wife too as well, because guys can be guilty of, you need to do this, you need to do that, you should do this, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way. The other thing too is, so that going to Krista's book, you're putting them in a situation where they succeeded once before, and it's easy to replicate. And that's also appreciative inquiry, that training that we take. The other thing too is never asking your spouse why, or anybody why.
Why is it bad? Yeah. Why is bad?
Yeah. Why is bad? It puts us on the defense, right?
Yeah.
So if you could reframe, the question, tell me more about that. It's fascinating. Tell me more about that. It's a totally different way to asking them why, or give me a reason, right? And why puts us on the defense. One other thing too is getting your spouse to say no. And I'm sure you probably know more of the psychological reasons why it's more comforting for the person who's being questioned to say no than it is to say yes. When we're forced to say yes, we feel backed into a corner, and it's like we're surrendering our yes. But when you say no, hey, would you have any objection to talking a little bit about how you handled Christopher last week? 'Cause it was really good. No, I don't have any objection. It's the same thing as like when a salesperson calls you and is like, hey, do you like drinking clean water? Yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to have clean water on a daily basis? Yes. It's like, where are you taking me? I'm already suspicious,
Yeah, that's funny.
So, yeah.
Those are some good points, because I think, first of all, those would work with anybody. Those are just good communication. Those would work with your kids.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from a counterintuitive place, probably, when you're already frustrated with your partner and you have all these expectations, but taking a step back and recognizing, that when you highlight what people are doing well, I think just in general, they want to do more of it. They feel appreciated. Yes. They feel valued. They feel validated. They feel heard, so even if you don't have a husband who's going to process it the way that you just did in a beautiful sort of way, I think some of us probably don't have husbands that are going to have like that level of epiphany. But even if you just say, wow. And sometimes I'm very like kind of quasi demeaning to myself, even when I'm working with my kids, I'll say something like, I don't know if I would have been able to handle it that way. Like I probably would have barked back at him in that moment, because he was being really feisty. That was awesome the way you handled that. I'm glad you handled that instead of me right then. I think could be a really good approach to foster those moments more, because I think you're right. They want to hear what they're doing well. No one wants to feel like a failure.
Right. Yeah. Praise is so much easier than criticism, right?
Well, it feels better, even as
does.
As the person who's giving it, when you're spewing positivity, it tends to feel better.
Yeah.
And shifts your mindset as well.
I agree. I totally agree.
So how do you think dads in general can help anxious kids? Speaking from as a dad, and raising a child who has some anxious personality issues going on, how would you approach that?
So I'll preface this with, I suck at this half the time.
Kind of, we all do.
So, yeah, I wish I was as good as, like, I tell my wife this all the time. I was like, if I could do half the things that I talk about on the podcast, it'd be outstanding.
Me too.
Right? Yeah. But I think that's what makes us human. But yeah, so I think coming at the approach of empathy with your kids, and not sympathy and not anger, right? So let me give you an example. Empathy is like, hey, let me connect with you where you're at, right? Let's be on the same level. Sympathy is like, I'm up here, you're down here. Sorry that happened to you. Let me give you a pat on the head, right? Which is kind of demeaning to anybody. It's demeaning to it's demeaning to us. It's like,
Yeah.
even when someone passes away, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. It kind of makes you feel sort of worse in a way.
Yeah.
But if you're like, I totally understand it. My wife or my mom passed away last year too. It's extremely hard, and it's a hard pill to swallow. I get it. You immediately are like, wow, I feel better because someone's relating to me versus like
Yeah.
therapy. So I think with our kids, when they're going through a tough time, like, so for instance, I went through a really tough time 2 years ago with a sleep episode and suffered. And we can get into it later if you want, but I suffered through that and then ended up dealing with PTSD for about 9 months afterwards. And what I noticed is, even here we are 2 years later, and I went through so many sleepless nights, 33 straight days of about 90 minutes, 2 hours a night of sleep.
Wow.
And I remember like staring at the wall. And to me, like I've said this to my wife, and I don't know if my son has ever heard it, but at night the demons come out.
Yeah.
Like, could this I mean, last night was a perfect example. For some reason, I had a hard time, like, just trying to get to sleep, and my mind just started racing. Like, what if this is the night it happens again?
Mm.
Like, these things start to come out, and then your mind gets carried away. My son, same thing. He's like, and it's hard for him to talk about. So you almost have to applaud, no matter how hard the truth is to hear, you have to applaud them for being brave enough to tell you what's going on in their mind, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think one thing that we're guilty of as fathers and mothers is we should on our kids. We shouldn't
Yeah.
feel that way, and then the kid feels shame and guilt and like, well, I'm not going to open up to them anymore.
Yeah.
So I think when, like, so for instance, my son's like, you know, I struggle to get to sleep at night. Tell me about that. I don't say why. Tell me about that. When I lay down, the demons come out. And so he's had to have heard that from me at some point. I'm like, what? Tell me about the demons. The demons are like, I just worry. I worry about school. I worry. I replay certain tough times during the day with my friends. I worry about, like, are we going to have food on the table? Are we going to have this? And all these things. I'm like, there's that part of me that's like, dude, we're fine. We're more than fine. Like, things are going very well. Like, you'll never be without. But instead of, like, hey, well, where does all that come from? I don't really know. I just feel that way. And another quote that we use all the time in our community is, people operate in certain behaviors because it makes sense to them. So what my son is going through, or what your son's going through, your daughter, anybody who's listening with your kids, they're operating in a way that makes sense to them at the time. And so what I've noticed, and I've been guilty of shitting on him, is like, hey, you shouldn't feel that way. Like, we're fine. You're good. You're 11-year-old. What problems do you have? You know,
Yeah.
and look at what you've got: a nice room. You've got friends. You make good grades. You're playing football. Like, you don't have any problems. And I've been guilty of that. And that just shuts him down. On the flip side, when I look at him and say, dude, I know exactly where you're coming from, because you saw when I went through my sleep thing, and for me, the demons come out as well. Would you have any objections to me sharing some insights with you that have worked for me? And again, I'm getting him to say no,
Mm-hmm.
because that makes him feel more in control. No, I don't. Okay. So when I'm laying there, what I normally do is I try to keep my eyes open, because when I close my eyes, that's when the thoughts start to roll. I keep my eyes open and I just start to pray, or I just start to think about things that I'm grateful for, and what I notice is I can literally feel like my body and my mind start to calm when I put myself in that place of thankfulness and gratitude and prayer, and that calms me down. And maybe what we could do, if you don't have any objections, again, going for the no, I'm happy to lay next to you in bed and we can do some headspace meditation. Or, I know you love to read. I love to read. Let's lay in your bed together, side by side. We'll read together, and we'll calm those demons down together. And I think that's a way you can, if you want to feel good as a dad, that's what makes, I walk out of that room feeling like I did it. I did good. Like, that makes me. And then when I walk out of his room doing the other, like, you shouldn't feel that way. You should do this. You should do that. You should be thinking these stuff. Then I walk out of that room feeling like, that sucked. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So that's what's helped me in the past, and hopefully maybe that helps some of your listeners.
I think it's a good shift again, because it's about control. I think a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is about control, that we don't control our partners, and we don't control our kids. And I think sometimes we're so uncomfortable with how they're feeling that we do shit on them, because and especially this might poke at men even more than women, because of how anxiety is perceived as a weakness, or they're not being brave, or a vulnerability that is not masculine, and not realizing that it's a physiological condition. And you can have the bravest kid in the world, or the most empowered kid in the world, and they can have anxiety. Or you can have a child that is just genetically going to have that. So I like I like the spectrum that you talked about, as far as not sympathizing, because I think sometimes people do that because they think they're being a good parent at that point. Let me just be sympathetic. I'm sorry, that happened. Let's just try to make you feel better, because I'm uncomfortable with how you're feeling right now. So let's just fix this right away, instead of letting kids sit there and then ask them for permission. I love the way you said that. Ask them for permission to jump in, because I say this all the time, if anyone listens to me, this is their journey. We're just passengers on their journey. And so I love how you just asked him for permission to share some approaches. And it was just, it's in such a respectful way that I think kids are going to really, really engage with that more. And if they're not, it's their journey.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I wish I could do this more than half the time, but yeah. The other thing too, I wanted to share too is, empathy is one, asking questions, but we're big on emotional validation, validating that emotion, because do you know who Gary John Bishop is?
No.
Is this a clean show?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
So no, it's okay. He wrote the book Unf Yourself.
Okay.
It hit the New York Times bestsellers, and we had an event last year called the Dad Edge Summit, and we brought him in to speak. And he is like really rough around the edges. He'll scare you. But one thing that he said is, emotions are neither good nor bad; they just are. Right. And with all your experience, that as well. Emotions are neither good nor bad; they just are. So I think when your kids are spouting emotions, right, and sometimes we're listening to them like, how in the world could you feel that way? Like, what's wrong with you? Like like a lot of us, we get in that mindset of like, what's wrong with you? This has got to be a reflection on me if you're feeling that way. And then we start to like point the finger back at us, like, I must be doing something wrong because he shouldn't feel that way, or she shouldn't feel that way. But I think if we understand, like, emotions are neither bad nor good, they just are. And those emotions make perfectly good sense to that person, to that kid, to that spouse at the time that they are feeling them. And then one of the worst things we can do to demean someone is to not validate those emotions. So like when you can sit there and say, I mean, how insulted are you when you are vulnerable and you're like, hey, like, I feel really scared right now about my financial future because like, I just don't know if we have enough, in the pipeline, we have this or that. That is really stupid. Why would you feel that way? Like, we've got plenty, you're good, we're good. Yeah. And you're like, wow, I really feel like crap.
Yeah.
But when you say, man, I totally get it, um, it's that could be a real fear. And I understand that because, in our business, we go through the peaks and valleys as well. Sometimes I look at our pipeline, I'm like, oh, wow, what's going on here? And maybe some of the things we could ask ourselves is, what can I do to fill that pipeline? And that conversation feels very, very differently when someone has gotten on our level and emotionally validated us.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And I think sometimes parents do personalize it too, because they are over identifying with their kids. And so they're like, they're mini me's, souped up mini me's, where it's like, if my mini me is not okay, then I've caused that on some level. And so then there's this extra burden of responsibility, where emotions are just emotions, and letting kids sit with the emotion and not having to feel like the burden of fixing it. And that might be more like, husbands might feel that more so. I think moms do too, for sure, depending on their anxiety levels. But being okay with just letting your kids be in the moment. My daughter was a total puddle this morning. She has to get blood work this afternoon because she has celiac. So every 3 months, we're going to go through this trauma. and she's got anxiety, and it just wasn't going to be okay today, and just accepting that. My husband accepted that. We knew today's going to be a rough morning. It was actually better than I thought, but we just let her be, her very, very negative self. And it there was no fuel to the fire. I think when you kind of accept stuff and you just say, hey, do you want to reset? Change the channel in your brain, watch TV, I'll get you some crackers, settle your stomach, and hold your hand. That could be very effective because you're not owning it. You're not owning it.
Yeah, you're not. I mean, that is unbelievable advice.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. You had some major gold words of wisdom, and I think it'll be really helpful for the fathers in the audience as well to just hear from a male perspective on parenting.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So where can people find you? You've got a new fan. I'm going to just totally binge your podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, you can. So Instagram, I'm usually pretty active over there. You can find me at the Dad Edge. Everything we do, kind of confusing, but everything we do is at gooddadproject.com. That's kind of the umbrella. We had a brand shift back in 2018 to Dad Edge. That's why our podcast now called the Dad Edge Podcast. We've got the Dad Edge community on Facebook as well. And then we have our Alliance community, it's a mastermind group of fathers. It's our virtual mastermind community. We're right now, I mean, it changes every week, but 337 men are doing life together. And you can find all the information there at gooddadproject.com/alliance. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah. How cool would it be to get our husbands to join the Alliance?
Hey, that'd be cool. Yeah.
I'm gonna start working on it right away. Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
You bet.